Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome back to In Search of the Miraculous, our study and reading of. We've arrived at chapter 13, which is interesting for a number of reasons, one of which is we experience the first sort of mystical tale, I suppose, mystical experience. Ouspensky refers to it as a miracle. And all throughout the book is sort of, there's philosophy and religion and mysticism all interspersed, and theory, cosmology and psychology. But in this chapter, Ouspensky has what he calls a miracle, or you could call it a mystical experience. And that takes up sort of, the middle part of the chapter. And we'll go through the contents in a moment. While we wait for everyone to come in, I'll just read the contents of what's contained in the chapter, and then we'll get right into it. But like you'll see in a moment, this miracle is very interesting to consider relative to our own views of the world. So let's look at the contents of chapter 13. Intensity of inner work, preparation for facts, a visit to Finland, the miracle begins. Mental conversations with G, what I was speaking about. You are not asleep, seeing sleeping people. Impossibility of investigating higher phenomenon by ordinary means. A changed outlook on methods of action. Chief feature. G defines people's chief feature. Reorganization of the group. Those who leave the work. Sitting between two stools. Difficulty of coming back. G's apartment. Reactions to silence. Seeing lies. A demonstration. How to awake. How to create the emotional state necessary. 3 ways. The necessity of sacrifice. Sacrificing one's suffering. Expanded table of hydrogens. A moving diagram. A new discovery. We have very little time. And so all that's coming up, and like you see there, the miracle in Finland, we will read in a moment. Hello there, Evie. My day's been very good, thanks. I'm very well. Hello there, Ali and Zanya. Nice to see you, my friend. Welcome. And so without further ado, let's read this chapter together. As I say, I'm reading from my screen, so any comments I'll address at the end, or maybe in the middle if I check them, but at the end will be ideal. So for now, let's read chapter 13 of In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky. This period, the middle of the summer of 1916, has remained in the memory of all the members of our groups as a time of very great inner intensity in our work. We all felt that we had to hurry, that we were doing too little compared with the immensity of the task we had set ourselves. We realized that our chance of knowing more might go just as suddenly as it had come, and we tried to increase the pressure of work in ourselves and to do all that we could while conditions were favorable. I began a series of experiments or exercises making use of a certain experience in this direction that I had acquired earlier. I carried out a series of short but very intensive fasts. I call them intensive because I did not take them at all from the hygienic point of view, but tried, on the contrary, to give the strongest possible shocks to the organism. In addition to this, I began to breathe according to a definite system, which, together with fasting, had given me interesting psychological results before, and also repetition on the method of the prayer of the mind, which had helped me very much before to concentrate my attention and to observe myself. And also a series of mental exercises of a rather complicated kind for the concentration of the attention. I do not describe these experiments and exercise in detail because they were, after all, attempts to feel my way without having exact knowledge of possible results. But all these things taken together, as well as our talks and meetings, kept me in a state of unusual tension, and to a great extent, of course, prepared me for the series of extraordinary experiences which I had to go through in August 1916. Because G kept his word, and I saw facts, and at the same time understood what G meant when he said that many other things are necessary before facts. These other things consisted in preparation, in understanding certain ideas, and in being in a certain state. This state, which is emotional, is exactly what we do not understand. That is, we do not understand that it is indispensable and the facts are not possible without it. I now come to a most difficult thing because there is no possibility whatever of describing the facts themselves. Why? I've often put this question to myself, and I could only answer that there was far too much in them of what was personal for them to be made common property, and I think that it was so not only in my case, but that it always is so. I remember that assertions of this kind always made me indignant when I came across them in the memoirs or the notes of people who had passed through any sort of extraordinary experiences and afterwards refused to describe them. They had sought the miraculous and, in one form or another, they thought they had found it. But when they had found what they sought, they invariably said, "I have found it, but I cannot describe what I have found." It always seemed to me to be artificial and invented. And now I found myself in exactly the same position. I had found what I sought. I saw and observed facts that entirely transcended the sphere of what we consider possible, acknowledged, or admissible, and I can say nothing about them. The principal part of these experiences was in their inner content and in the new knowledge which came with them, but even the outer aspect could be described only very approximately. As I've already said, after all my fasts and other experiments, I was in a rather excited and nervous state, and physically less steady than usual. I arrived at the country house of E.N.M. in Finland, at whose house in St. Petersburg we had of late often had our meetings. G and about 8 of our people were there. In the evening the talk went on our attempts to tell about our lives. G was very harsh and sarcastic, as though he was trying to provoke now one, now another of us, and in particular he emphasized our cowardice and the laziness of our thought. I was particularly affected when he began to repeat in front of everyone something I had told him in absolute confidence, what I thought of Dr. S. What he said was very unpleasant for me principally because I had always condemned such talk in others. I think it was about 10 o'clock that he called me, Dr. S. and Z into a small separate room. We sat on the floor, Turkish fashion, and G began to explain and to show us certain postures and physical movements. I could not help noticing that there was an astonishing assurance and precision in all his movements, although the movements and postures themselves did not present any particular problem, and a good gymnast could have done them without exceptional difficulty. I had never had any pretensions to the role of an athlete, but I could imitate them outwardly. G explained that although a gymnast could of course do these movements, the gymnast would do them in a different way from him, and that he did them in a special way, with muscles relaxed. Afterwards G again passed to the question why we could not tell the story of our lives, and with this the miracle began. Hello there, Stephen, as well. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you here. I always enjoy seeing people join me for In Search of the Miraculous. It's wonderful. More so than any other book, if I'm honest. So thanks for being here and sharing this with me. So here we go. The Miraculous. And with this, the miracle began. I can say with complete assurance that G did not use any kind of external methods. That is, he gave me no narcotics, nor did he hypnotize me by any of the known methods. It all started with my beginning to hear his thoughts. We were sitting in a small room with a carpetless wooden floor, as it happens in country houses. I sat opposite G, and Dr. Z and Z at either side. G spoke of our features, of our inability to see or to speak the truth. His words perturbed me very much, and suddenly I noticed that among the words which he was saying to us, there were thoughts which were intended for me. I caught one of these thoughts and replied to it, speaking aloud in the ordinary way. G nodded to me and stopped speaking. There was a fairly long pause. He sat still, saying nothing. After a while I heard his voice inside me, as it were in the chest, near the heart. He put a definite question to me. I looked at him. He was sitting and smiling. His question provoked in me a very strong emotion, but I answered him in the affirmative way. Or in the affirmative. Why did he say that? asked G, looking in turn at Z and Dr. S. Did I ask him anything? And he at once put another, still more difficult question to me in the same way as before, and I again answered it in a natural voice. Z and S were visibly astonished at what was taking place, especially Z. This conversation, if it can be called a conversation, proceeded in this fashion for not less than half an hour. G put questions to me without words, and I answered them, speaking in the usual way. I was very agitated by the things G said to me, and the things he asked me, which I cannot transmit. The matter was concerned with certain conditions which I had either to accept or leave the work. G gave me a month's time. I refused the time and said that no matter how difficult what he demanded was, I would carry it out at once, but G insisted on the month's time. At length he got up, and we went on to the veranda. On the other side of the house was another very large veranda, where the rest of our people were sitting. What transpired after this I can say very little about, although the chief things happened after G was speaking with Z and S. Then something he said about me affected me very strongly, and I sprang up from my chair and went into the garden. From there I went into the forest. I walked about there for a long time in the dark, wholly in the power of the most extraordinary thoughts and feelings. Sometimes it seemed to me that I had found something. At other times I lost it again. This went on for 1 or 2 hours. Finally, at the moment of what felt like the climax of contradictions and of inner turmoil, there flashed through my mind a thought, following which I very quickly came to a clear and right understanding of all G had said and of my own position. I saw that G was right, that what I had considered to be firm and reliable in myself in reality did not exist. But I had found something else. I knew that he would not believe me, and that he would laugh at me if I showed him this other thing. But for myself it was indubitable, and what happened later showed that I was right. For a long time I sat and smoked in a kind of glade. When I returned to the house it was already dark on the small veranda. Thinking that everyone had gone to bed, I went to my own room and went to bed myself. As a matter of fact, G and the others were at that time having supper on the large veranda. A little while after I had gone to bed, a strange excitement again began in me. My pulse began to beat forcibly, and I again heard G's voice in my chest. On this occasion I not only heard, but I replied mentally, and G heard me and answered me. There was something very strange in this conversation. I tried to find something that would confirm it as a fact, but could find nothing. And after all, it could have been imagination or a waking dream, because although I tried to ask G something of a concrete nature that would have left no doubt about the conversation or his participation in it, I could not invent anything weighty enough. And certain questions I asked him and which he answered, I could have asked and answered myself. I even had the impression that he avoided concrete answers which later might serve as proofs, and to 1 or 2 of my questions he intentionally gave indefinite answers. But the feeling that it was a conversation was very strong and entirely new and unlike anything else. After one long pause, G asked me something that at once put me all on the alert, then stopped, as if waiting for an answer. What he said suddenly put a stop to all my thoughts and feelings. It was not fear, at least not a conscious fear when one knows that one is afraid, but I was all shivering and something literally paralyzed me completely so that I could not articulate a single word, although I made terrible efforts wishing to give an affirmative reply. I felt that G was waiting and that he would not wait long. "Well, you are tired now," he said at last. "We will leave it till another time." I began to say something. I think I asked him to wait, to give me a little time to get accustomed to this thought. "Another time," said his voice. "Sleep." And his voice stopped. I could not go to sleep for a long time. In the morning, as I came out onto the little terrace where we had sat the evening before, G was sitting in the garden 20 yards away near a round table. There were 3 of our people with him. "Ask him what happened last night," said G. For some reason this made me angry. I turned and walked towards the terrace. As I reached it, I again heard G's voice in my chest. "Stop." I stopped and turned towards G. He was smiling. "Where are you going? Sit down here," he said in his ordinary voice. I sat with him, but I could say nothing, nor did I want to talk. At the same time, I felt a kind of extraordinary clarity of thought, and I decided to try to concentrate on certain problems which had seemed to me to be particularly difficult. The thought came to my mind that in this unusual state I might perhaps find answers to questions which I could not find in the ordinary way. I began to think about the first triad of the ray of creation, about the three forces which made one force. What could they mean? Can we define them? Can we realize their meaning? Something began to formulate itself in my head, but just as I tried to translate this into words, everything disappeared. Will, consciousness. And what was the third? I asked myself. It seemed to me that if I could name the third, I would at once understand everything else. Leave it, G said aloud. I turned my eyes towards him, and he looked at me. That is a very long way away yet, he said. You cannot find the answer now. Better think of yourself, of your work. The people sitting with us looked at us in perplexity. G had answered my thoughts. Then something very strange began that lasted the whole day and afterwards. We stayed in Finland 3 days longer. During these 3 days there were very many talks about the most varied subjects, and I was in an unusual emotional state all the time, which sometimes began to be burdensome. How can this be got rid of? I cannot bear it any more, I asked G. Do you want to go to sleep? Said G. Certainly not, I said. Then what are you asking about? This is what you wanted. Make use of it. You are not asleep at this moment. I do not think that this was altogether true. I undoubtedly slept at moments. Many things that I said at that time must have surprised my companions in this strange adventure very much, and I was surprised at many things myself. Many things were like sleep. Many things had no relation whatever to reality. Undoubtedly, I invented a lot. Afterwards, it was very strange for me to remember the things I had said. At length, we went to St. Petersburg. G went to Moscow, and we went to the Nikolaevsky station, straight from the Finland station. A fairly large company had met together to see him off. He went. But the Miraculous was still far from ended. There were new and very strange phenomena again late in the evening of that day, and I conversed with him while seeing him in the compartment of the train going to Moscow. After this there followed a strange period of time. It lasted about 3 weeks, and during this period from time to time I saw sleeping people. This requires a particular explanation. 2 or 3 days after G's departure, I was walking along the Troitsky street, and suddenly I saw that the man who was walking towards me was asleep. There could be no doubt whatever about this. Although his eyes were open, he was walking along, obviously immersed in dreams which ran like clouds across his face. It entered my mind that if I could look at him long enough, I should see his dreams. That is, I should understand what he was seeing in his dreams. But he passed on. After him came another, also sleeping. A sleeping izvozchik went by with 2 sleeping passengers. Suddenly I found myself in the position of the prince in the sleeping princess. Everyone around me was asleep. It was an indubitable and distinct sensation. I realized what it meant, that many things could not be seen with our eyes, which we do not usually see. These sensations lasted for several minutes. Then they were repeated very weakly on the following day. But I at once made the discovery that by trying to remember myself, I was able to intensify and prolong these sensations for so long as I had energy enough not to be diverted, that is, not to allow things and everything around me to attract my attention. When attention was diverted, I ceased to see sleeping people, because I had obviously gone to sleep myself. I told only a few of our people of these experiments, and 2 of them, when they tried to remember themselves, had similar experiences. Afterwards, everything became normal. I could not give myself a clear account of what exactly had taken place, but everything in me had been turned upside down, and there is no doubt that in the things I said and thought during these 3 weeks there was a good deal of fantasy. But I had seen myself, that is, I had seen things in myself that I had never seen before. There could be no doubt about it, and although I afterwards became the same as I had been before, I could not help knowing that this had been, and I could forget nothing. One thing I understood even then with undoubted clarity. that no phenomena of a higher order, that is, transcending the category of ordinary things observable every day, or phenomena which are sometimes called metaphysical, can be observed or investigated by ordinary means, in an ordinary state of consciousness, like physical phenomena. It is a complete absurdity to think that it is possible to study phenomena of a higher order like telepathy, clairvoyance, foreseeing the future, mediumistic phenomena, and so on, in the same way as electrical, chemical, or meteorological phenomena are studied. There is something in phenomena of a higher order which requires a particular emotional state for their observation and study, and this excludes any possibility of properly conducted laboratory experiments and observations. I had previously arrived at the same conclusion after experiments of my own described in The New Model of the Universe in the chapter Experimental Mysticism, but now I understood the reason why this was impossible. The second interesting conclusion that I came to is much more difficult to describe. It relates to a change which I noticed in certain of my views, in certain formulations of my aims, desires, and aspirations. Many aspects of this became clear to me only afterwards, and afterwards I saw clearly that it was at this time that certain very definite changes began in my views on myself, on those around me, and particularly on methods of action, if this can be said without more precise definition. To describe the changes themselves is very difficult. I can only say that they were not in any way connected with what was said in Finland, but that they had come as a result of the emotions which I had experienced there. The first thing I could record was the weakening in me of that extreme individualism which, up to that time, had been the fundamental feature of my attitude to life. I began to see people more, to feel my community with them. And the second thing was that, somewhere very deep down inside me, I understood the esoteric principle of the impossibility of violence, that is, the uselessness of violent means to attain no matter what. I saw with undoubted clarity, and never afterwards did I wholly lose this feeling, that violent means and methods in anything whatever would unfailingly produce negative results, that is to say, results opposed to those aims for which they were applied. What I arrived at was like Tolstoy's non-resistance in appearance, but it was not at all non-resistance because I had reached it not from an ethical but from a practical point of view, not from the standpoint of what is better or what is worse, but from the standpoint of what is more effective and expedient. So let me know, guys, what you thought of that. Oh, hello there, Julie. Welcome. Nice to see you. Let me know what you thought of Ouspensky's miraculous mystical experience there. And it's very interesting that sort of this book is not, I'm just going to speak quickly about that experience and other books with similar experiences. This book isn't a storybook, right? This is Ouspensky's documentation of his time with Gurdjieff. So that is a real experience that Ouspensky had, or at least believes he had, or experienced, maybe I should say. He experienced those things, this inner dialogue with Gurdjieff. And if you've ever read the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda, it's very similar in that if you were just to hand it to a sort of a neophyte, someone who's not ever read anything spiritual or mystical or metaphysical, they would definitely think that this is like a storybook. This is a fantasy novel and a fantasy adventure, embroiled or embroidered or whatever the word is. All this stuff is made up. Yogananda has a vast, overactive imagination. But if you've read more other sorts of mystical stuff, then you can take it, more clearly, and the overactive part of your mind can quiet down and you just take it as it is. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about those experiences. And if you believe that it definitely could never happen, I would ask you to ask yourself, why do you feel that? Why do you believe that? But anyway, back to the text. The next time G came to St. Petersburg was in the beginning of September. I tried to question him about what had actually occurred in Finland. Was it true that he had said something that had frightened me, and why had I been frightened? If that was the case, it means you are not ready, said G. He explained nothing further. On this visit, the centre of gravity of the talks was in the chief feature or chief fault of each one of us. G was very ingenious in the definition of features. I realized on this occasion that not everyone's chief feature could be defined. With some people, this feature can be so hidden beneath different formal manifestations as to be almost impossible to find. And then a man can consider himself as his chief feature, just as I could call my chief feature Ouspensky, or, as G always called it, Petr Domanovich. Mistakes there cannot be because of Peter Domanovich, of each person form, so to speak, round his chief feature, which would mean that your personality forms around your chief feature, I think is what Ouspensky's saying. Whenever anyone disagreed with the definition of his chief feature given by G, he always said that the fact that the person disagreed with him showed that he was right. I disagree only with what you say is actually my chief feature, said one of our people. The chief feature which I know in myself is very much worse, but I do not dispute that people may see me as you describe. You know nothing in yourself, G told him. If you knew, you would not have that feature, and people certainly see you in the way I told you. But you do not see how they see you. If you accept what I told you as your chief feature, you will understand how people see you. And if you find a way to struggle with this chief feature and to destroy it, that is, to destroy its involuntary manifestations, G emphasized these words, you will produce on people not the impression that you do now, but any impression you like. With this began long talks about the impressions that a man produces on other people and how he can produce a desirable or an undesirable impression. Those around him see a man's chief feature, however hidden it may be. Of course, they cannot define it, but their definitions are often very good and very near. Take nicknames. Nicknames sometimes define chief features very well. The talk about impressions brought us once more to inner and outward considering. There cannot be proper outward considering while a man is seated in his chief feature, said G. For instance, so-and-so, he named one of our party, his feature is that he is never at home. How can he consider anything or anybody? I was astonished at the artistic finish of the feature that was represented by G. It was not psychology even, it was art. And psychology ought to be art, G replied. Psychology can never be simply a science. To another of our party he said on the question of feature that his feature was that he did not exist at all. You understand? I do not see you, said G. It does not mean that you are always like that, but when you are like you are now, you do not exist at all. He said to another that his chief feature was a tendency always to argue with everybody about everything. But then I never argue, the man very heatedly at once replied. Nobody could help laughing. G told another of our party, it was the middle-aged man on whom he had carried out the experiment of dividing personality from essence and who asked for raspberry jam, that his feature was that he had no conscience. The following day the man came and said that he had been in the public library and had looked through the encyclopedic dictionaries of 4 languages for the meaning of the word conscience. G merely waved his hand. To the other man, his companion in the experiment, G said that he had no shame, and he at once cracked a rather amusing joke against himself. On this occasion, G stopped in quarters on the Litany near the Nevsky. He had caught a severe chill, and we met at his place in small groups. He said once that there was no sense in our going on any further in this way, and that we ought to make a definite decision whether we wanted to go on with him, wanted to work, or whether it was better to abandon all attempts in this direction, because a half-serious attitude could give no results whatever. He added that he would continue the work only with those who would make a definite and serious decision to struggle with mechanicalness in themselves and with sleep. You already know by this time, he said, that nothing terrible is demanded of you, but there is no sense in sitting between 2 stools. Whoever does not want to wake up, at any rate, let him sleep well. He said that he would talk to each of us separately, and that each of us must show him sufficient reason why he, that is G, should trouble about him. You think perhaps that this affords me a great deal of satisfaction, he said, or perhaps you think that there is nothing else that I could do. If so, you are very gravely mistaken in both cases. There are very many other things that I could do, and if I give my time to this, it is only because I have a definite aim. By now you ought better to understand in what my aim consists, and by now you ought to see whether you are on the same road as I am or not. I will say nothing more. But in the future I shall work only with those who can be useful to me in attaining my aim, and only those people can be useful to me who have firmly decided to struggle with themselves, that is, to struggle with mechanicalness. With this the talk ended. G's talks with members of the group lasted about a week. With some he spoke for a very long time, with others not so long. Finally, almost everybody stayed on. P, the middle-aged man whom I have mentioned in connection with experiments in dividing personality from essence, came out of the situation with honor and quickly became a very active member of our group, only on occasions going astray into a formal attitude or in literal understanding. Only 2 people dropped off who, exactly as though through some kind of magic, as it seemed to us, suddenly ceased to understand anything and saw in everything that G said misunderstanding on his part and, on the part of the rest, a lack of sympathy and feeling. This attitude, at first mistrustful and suspicious and then openly hostile to almost all of us, coming from nobody knew where and full of strange and quite unexpected accusations, astonished us very much. We made everything a secret. We failed to tell them what G had spoken of in their absence. We told tales about them to G, trying to make him distrust them. We recounted to him all talks with them, leading him constantly into error by distorting all the facts and striving to present everything in a false light. We had given G wrong impressions about them, making him see everything far from as it was. At the same time, G himself had completely changed, had become altogether different from what he used to be before, had become harsh, requiring, had lost all feeling and all interest for individual people, had ceased to demand the truth from people, that he preferred to have round him people such as were afraid to tell him the truth, who were hypocrites, who threw flowers at one another and at the same time spied on the others. We were amazed at all these and similar talks. They brought with them immediately a kind of entirely new atmosphere, which up to this time we had not had. And it was particularly strange because precisely at this time, most of us were in a very emotional state and were particularly well disposed towards these 2 protesting members of our group. We tried many times to talk to G about them. He laughed very much when he told him that in their opinion we always gave him wrong impressions of them. How they value the work, he said, and what a miserable idiot I am from their point of view, how easily I am deceived. You see that they have ceased to understand the most important thing. In the work, the teacher of the work cannot be deceived. This is a law which proceeds from what has been said about knowledge and being. I may deceive you if I want to, but you cannot deceive me. If it were otherwise, you would not learn from me, and I would have to learn from you. How must we speak to them, and how can we help them to come back to the group? Some of us asked G. Not only can you do nothing, G said to them, but you ought not to try, because by such attempts you will destroy the last chance they have of understanding and seeing themselves. It is always very difficult to come back, and it must be an absolute voluntary decision without any sort of persuasion or constraint. You should understand that everything you have heard about me and yourselves are attempts at self-justification, endeavors to blame others in order to feel that they are in the right. It means more and more lying. It must be destroyed, and it can only be destroyed through suffering. If it was difficult for them to see themselves before, it will be 10 times more difficult now. How could this have happened? Others asked him. Why did their attitude towards all of us and towards you change so abruptly and unexpectedly? It is the first case for you, said G, and therefore it appears strange to you. But later on you will see that it happens very often, and you will see that it always takes place in the same way. The principal reason for it is that it is impossible to sit between two stools, and people usually think that they can sit between two stools, that is, that they can acquire the new and preserve the old. They do not think this consciously, of course, but it comes to the same thing. And what is it that they most of all desire to preserve? First, the right to have their own valuation of ideas and of people, that is, that which is more harmful for them than anything else. They are fools and they already know it. That is to say, they realized it at one time. For this reason they came to learn, but they forgot all about this the next moment. They are already bringing into the work their own paltry and subjective attitude. They begin to pass judgment on me and on everyone else, as though they were able to pass judgment on anything. And this is immediately reflected in their attitude towards the ideas and towards what I say. Already they accept one thing and they do not accept another thing. With one thing they agree, with another they disagree. They trust me in one thing, in another thing they do not trust me. And the most amusing part is that they imagine they are able to work under such conditions, that is, without trusting me in everything and without accepting everything. In actual fact, this is absolutely impossible. By not accepting something or mistrusting something, they immediately invent something of their own in its place. Gagging begins, new theories and new explanations which have nothing in common either with the work or with what I have said. Then they begin to find faults and inaccuracies in everything that I say or do, and in everything that others say or do. From this moment I now begin to speak of things about which I have no knowledge, and even of things which I have no conception, but which they know and understand much better than I do. All the other members of the group are fools, idiots, and so on, like a barrel organ. When a man says something on these lines, I already know all he will say later on, and you also will know by the consequences. And it is amusing that people can see this in relation to others. But when they themselves do crazy things, they at once cease to see it in relation to themselves. This is a law. It is difficult to climb the hill, but very easy to slide down it. They even feel no embarrassment in talking in such a manner, either with me or with other people. And chiefly they think that this can be combined with some kind of work. They do not even want to understand that when a man reaches this notch, his little song has been sung. And note one more thing. They are a pair. If they were separate, each one by himself, it would be easier for them to see their situation and come back. But they are a pair. They are friends, and one supports the other precisely in his weaknesses. Now one cannot return without the other, and even if they wanted to come back, I would just take one of them and not take the other. Why? Asked one of those present. That is another question entirely, said G. In the present case, simply in order to enable the other to ask himself who is the most important for him, I or his friend. If he is the most important, then there is nothing to talk about. But if I am the most important, then he must leave his friend and come back alone, and then afterwards the other may come back. But I tell you that they cling to one another and hinder one another. This is an exact example of how people do the very worst thing they possibly can for themselves when they depart from what is good in them. And this last concept here, where he's saying that it's because they're a pair, there's two of them, they complement each other, or I don't know if compliment's the right word, but one of them feels a thing, the other one backs the other one up, and there's sort of a what's the word that I'm looking for, like cognitive bias. There's a great Wikipedia page on cognitive biases, and you know, you've done so much work, you've worked so hard on yourselves, but even then after several months or years, you can still have these, it's like Gurdjieff saying, sitting between two stools. You can't sit between two stools. You have to be seeking to awaken, or like he said earlier in the chapter, sleep soundly, you know. Just leave the group and go and sleep well, he says. And this is the case, you know. If you can't be doing two things, or you can't be in the middle of two stools. In October, I was with G in Moscow. His small apartment on the Bolshaya Dimitrovka, all the floors and walls of which were covered in the Eastern style with carpets, and the ceilings hung with silk shawls, astonished me by its special atmosphere. First of all, people who came there, who were all G's pupils, were not afraid to keep silent. This alone was something unusual. They came, sat down, smoked. They often did not speak a single word for hours, and there was nothing oppressive or unpleasant in this silence. On the contrary, there was a feeling of assurance and of freedom from the necessity of playing a forced and invented role. But on chance and curious visitors, this silence produced an extraordinarily strange impression. They began to talk, and they talked without stopping, as if they were afraid of stopping and feeling something. On the other hand, others were offended. They thought that the silence was directed against them, in order to show them how much superior G's pupils were, and to make them understand that it was not worth while even talking to them. Others found it stupid, amusing, unnatural, and it showed our worst features, particularly our weakness and our complete subordination to G, who was oppressing us. P even decided to make notes of the reactions of various types of people to the silence. I realized in this place that people feared silence more than anything else, that our tendency to talk arises from self-defense and is always based upon a reluctance to see something, a reluctance to confess something to oneself. I quickly noticed a still stranger property of G's apartment. It was not possible to tell lies there. A lie at once became apparent, obvious, tangible, indubitable. Once there came an acquaintance of G's whom I had met before and who sometimes came to G's groups. Besides myself, there were 2 or 3 people in the apartment. G himself was not there. And having sat a while in silence, our guest began to tell how he had just met a man who had told him some extraordinarily interesting things about the war, about possibilities of peace, and so on. And suddenly, quite unexpectedly for me, I felt that he was lying. He had not met anybody, and nobody had told him anything. He was making it all up on the spot, simply because he could not endure the silence. I felt awkward looking at him. It seemed to me that if I looked at him, he would realize that I saw that he was lying. I glanced at the others and saw that they felt as I did, and were barely able to repress their smiles. Then I looked at the one who was talking, and I saw that he alone noticed nothing, and he continued to talk very rapidly, becoming more and more carried away by his subject, and not at all noticing the glances that we unintentionally exchanged with each other, with one another even. This was not the only case. I suddenly remembered the attempts we made in the summer to describe our lives and the intonations with which we spoke when we tried to hide the facts. I realized that here also the whole thing was in the intonations. When a man is chattering or simply waiting for an opportunity to begin, he does not notice the intonations of others and is unable to distinguish lies from the truth. But directly he is quiet himself, that is, awakes a little, he hears the different intonations and begins to distinguish other people's lies. We spoke several times with G's pupils on this subject. I told them what had happened in Finland and about the sleeping people I had seen on the streets of St. Petersburg. The feeling of mechanical lying people here in G's apartment reminded me very much of the feeling of sleeping people. I wanted very much to introduce some of my Moscow friends to G, but from among all those whom I met during these days, only one, my old newspaper friend V.A.A., produced the impression of being sufficiently alive, although he was as usual overloaded with work and rushing from one place to another. But he was very interested when I told him about G, and with G's permission, I invited him to have lunch at G's place. G summoned about 15 of his people and arranged a lunch which, at that time, was luxurious, with zakuski pies, shashlik, kagetia wine, and so on. In a word, it was one of those Caucasian lunches that begin at midday and last till the evening. He seated A near him, was very kind to him, entertained him all the time, and poured out wine for him. My heart suddenly fell when I realized to what a test I had brought my old friend. The fact was that everyone kept silence. A held out for 5 minutes, then he began to talk. He spoke of the war, of all our allies and enemies together, and separately he communicated the opinions of all the public men of Moscow and St. Petersburg upon all possible subjects. Then he talked about the desiccation of vegetables for the army, with which he was then occupied in addition to his journalistic work, particularly the desiccation of onions, then about artificial manures, agricultural chemistry and chemistry in general, about melioration, about spiritism, the materialization of hands. Oh, what's going on there? Sorry. And about what else I do not remember now. Neither G nor anyone else spoke a single word. I was on the point of speaking, fearing that A would be offended, but G looked at me so fiercely that I stopped short. Besides, my fears were in vain. Poor A noticed nothing. He was so carried away by his own talk and his own eloquence that he sat on happily at the table and talked without stopping for a moment until 4 o'clock. Then, with great feeling, he shook hands with G and thanked him for his very interesting conversation. G, looking at me, laughed slyly. I felt very ashamed. They had made a fool of poor A. He certainly could not have expected anything of the kind, so he was caught. I realized that G had given a demonstration to his people. There, you see, he said, when A had gone. He is called a clever man, but he would not have noticed it, even if I had taken his trousers off him. Only let him talk. He wants nothing else, and everybody is like that. This one was much better than many others. He told no lies, and he really knew what he talked about, in his own way, of course. But think, what use is he? He is no longer young, and perhaps this was the one time in his life when there was an opportunity of hearing the truth, and he talked himself all the time. Of the Moscow talks with G, I remember one, which is connected with another talk in St. Petersburg I have already given. This time G himself began to speak. What do you find is the most important thing of all you have learned up till now? He asked me. The experiences, of course, which I had in August, I said. If I were able to evoke them at will and use them, it would be all that I could wish for, because I think that then I should be able to find all the rest. But at the same time, I know that these experiences, I choose this word only because there is no other, but you understand of what I speak. He nodded, depended on the emotional state that I was in. The emotional state I was in then. And I know that they will always depend on this. If I could create such an emotional state in myself, I should very quickly come to these experiences, but I feel infinitely far from this emotional state, as though I were asleep. This is sleep that I was being awake. This is sleep that was being awake. How can this emotional state be created? Tell me. There are 3 ways, said G. First, this state can come by itself, accidentally. Second, someone else can create it in you. And third, you can create it in yourself. Which do you prefer? I confess that for a second I had a very strong desire to say that I preferred someone else, that is him, to create in me the emotional state of which I was speaking. But I at once realized that he would say that he had already done it once, and that now I ought either to wait until this came of itself, or that I ought to do something myself to get it. I want, of course, to create it myself, I said, but how can it be done? I have already said before that sacrifice is necessary, said G. Without sacrifice, nothing can be attained. But if there is anything in the world that people do not understand, it is the idea of sacrifice. They think they have to sacrifice something that they have. For example, I once said that they must sacrifice faith, tranquility, health. They understand this literally. But then the point is that they have not got either faith or tranquility or health. All these words must be taken in quotation marks. In actual fact, they have to sacrifice only what they imagine they have, and which in reality they do not have. They must sacrifice their fantasies, but this is difficult for them, very difficult. It is much easier to sacrifice real things. Another thing that people must sacrifice is their suffering. It is very difficult also to sacrifice one's suffering. A man will renounce any pleasures you like, but he will not give up his suffering. A man is made in such a way that he is never so much attached to anything as he is to his suffering. And it is necessary to be free from suffering. No one who is not free from suffering, who has not sacrificed his suffering, can work. Later on, a great deal must be said about suffering. Nothing can be attained without suffering, but at the same time, one must begin by sacrificing suffering. Now decipher what this means. I stayed in Moscow about a week and returned to St. Petersburg with a fresh store of ideas and impressions. Here a very interesting occurrence took place which explained many things to me in the system and in G's methods of instruction. During the period of my stay in Moscow, G's pupils had explained to me various laws relating to man and the world. Among others, they showed me again the table of hydrogens, as we called it in St. Petersburg, but in a considerably expanded form. Namely, besides the 3 scales of hydrogens which G had worked out for us before, they had taken the reduction further and had made in all 12 scales. So I'm going to show you table 4 quickly, and then I'm sure Ouspensky will show it, and then maybe I'll show it again once he showed it. But this is the table, the expanded table of hydrogens, and if you see here, I don't know what it would be called in maths, but in the top left corner and the bottom right corner, you got H6, then H1 next to it, and it's almost like a, I don't know what it would be called in mathematical terminology, but there you see it. I know, Zanya, I was going to share that in the group. But yeah, I'll address these things at the end, Zanya, and we'll discuss. But hello there, Nikos, as well. Welcome. So that's table 4. In such a form, the table was scarcely comprehensible. I was not able to convince myself of the necessity of reduced scales. Let us take, for instance, the 7th scale, said P. The absolute here is hydrogen 96. Fire can serve as an example of hydrogen 96. Hydrogen, then, is the absolute for a piece of wood. Let us take the 9th scale. Here the absolute is hydrogen 384, or water. Water will be the absolute for a piece of sugar. But I was unable to grasp the principle on the basis of which it would be possible to determine exactly when to make use of such a scale. P showed me a table made up to the 5th scale and relating to parallel levels in different worlds, but I got nothing from it. I began to think whether it was not possible to unite all these various scales with the various cosmoses, and having dwelt on this thought, I went in an absolutely wrong direction, because the cosmoses, of course, had no relation whatever to the division of the scale. It seemed to me at the same time that I had in general ceased to understand anything in the 3 octaves of radiations from which the 1st scale of hydrogens was deduced. The principal stumbling block here was the relation of the 3 forces, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 3, 2, and the relations between carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. At the same time, I realized that this contained something important, and I left Moscow with the unpleasant feeling that not only had I not acquired anything new, but that I seemed to have lost the old, that is, what I thought I had already understood. We had an agreement in our group that whoever went to Moscow and heard any new explanations or lectures must, on his arrival in St. Petersburg, communicate it all to the others. But on the way to St. Petersburg, while going carefully in my head through the Moscow talks, I felt that I would not be able to communicate the principal thing because I did not understand it myself. This irritated me, and I did not know what I was to do. In this state I arrived at St. Petersburg, and on the following day I went to our meeting. Trying to draw out as much as possible the beginning of the diagrams, as we called a part of G's system, dealing with general questions and laws, I began to convey the general impressions of my journey, and all the time I was saying one thing in my head, another thing was running. How shall I begin? What does the transition 1, 2, 3 into 1, 3, 2 mean? Can an example of such a transition be found in the phenomenon we know? I felt that I must find something now, immediately, because unless I found something myself first, I could say nothing to the others. I began to draw the diagram on the board. It was the diagram of radiations in 3 octaves, absolute, sun, earth, moon. We were already accustomed to this terminology and to G's form of exposition, but I did not know at all what I would say beyond what they already knew. And suddenly a single word which came into my head and which no one had pronounced in Moscow connected and explained everything. A moving diagram. I realized that it was necessary to imagine this diagram as a moving one, all the links in the chain changing places as in some mystical dance. I felt so much in this word that for some time I did not hear myself what I was saying. But after I had collected my thoughts, I saw that they were listening to me and that I had explained everything I had not understood myself on the way to the meeting. This gave me an extraordinarily strong and clear sensation, as though I had discovered for myself new possibilities, a new method of perception and understanding by giving explanations to other people. And under the impetus of this sensation, as soon as I had said that examples or analogies or the transition of the forces 1, 2, 3 and 1, 3, 2 must be found in the real world, I at once saw these examples both in the human organism and in the astronomical world and in mechanics, in the movements of waves. I afterwards had a talk with G about various scales, the purpose of which I did not understand. We waste time on guessing riddles, I said. Would it not be simpler to help us solve these more quickly? You know that before us there are many other difficulties. We shall never reach them, going at this pace. You yourself have said, and very often, that we have very little time. It is precisely because there is little time and because there are many difficulties ahead that it is necessary to do as I am doing, said G. If you are afraid of these difficulties, what will it be like later on? Do you think that anything is given in completed form in schools? You look at this very naively. You must be cunning. You must pretend, lead up to things in conversation. Sometimes things are learned from jokes, from stories, and you want everything to be simple. This never happens. You must know how to take when it is not given, to steal if necessary, but not to wait for somebody to come and give it to you. And that is chapter 13. And I'll just say quickly that chapter 14, Gurdjieff is very famous for bringing to the world, I think, to the Western world particularly, but to the world, the diagram called the Enneagram. I think it's been co-opted and stolen by some new age schools, if you like. I've seen Enneagram all over the place now, but I believe it was Gurdjieff who brought it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe someone can correct me. But as far as I'm aware, this symbol came from Gurdjieff and his ideas, and that it's been adopted, maybe is a better word, rather than co-opted. It's been adopted by other sort of new age spiritual stuff and schools, and they've sort of adopted, stolen it, in my opinion. And if anyone feels differently, please let me know in the comments. But if anyone's got any questions or comments before we go, they'll be welcome. And I'm just going to read out Zanya's made a couple of great observations. And this is what the Gurdjieff and Ouspensky work is all about. One must read the chapter, whatever chapter it is, whatever section it is, whatever paragraph it is, whatever concept that you're currently on and thinking about. And then you must go out into the world. You must go out into life and try and observe that thing in yourself. I was going to say in other people, but I don't think it's important to observe it in other people. It's important to observe it in yourself. And Zanya has said here, very openly, I really like the example of A speaking non-stop. It is something I find myself in a lot. And I think a lot of us do, Zanya, because it's sort of the natural thing, isn't it? It's a natural thing to do. There's space, so one wants to fill the space because the space is uncomfortable, so you want to fill it. And like Gurdjieff's describing in his apartment, it's a hilarious story of this, I don't know what he was, a paper merchant or a newspaper or an editor or something, and he just spoke for hours, and then at the end said, thanks for the great, interesting conversation, and then left. But like Gurdjieff says to Ouspensky, it doesn't matter. He's asleep. He's not aware of any of that. And so just leave him be. And Zanya has quoted from the chapter, a man will renounce any pleasures you like, but he will not give up his suffering. And I think elsewhere in one of the other Gurdjieff books, Gurdjieff says that if you try to take his suffering away, he'll become offended and maybe even attack you, because people are so identified with their suffering that they don't want it to be taken away. And I mean, with some of the movements going on now in the world, this suffering is sort of impressed upon the children of these people. It's not enough that they suffer. They want their children to suffer as well, and everyone's fine with it. But I won't get detracted or distracted and digress into comments on modern culture, because that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to read In Search of the Miraculous, and I have planned to do several commentary videos, but again, I've mentioned before, and Kathy, one of our group, helped me to begin, but the resistance is back, and so I'm dealing with that and trying to overcome it, to do some commentary videos. And like I say, it helps or is helpful if anyone's got any questions or would like to hear any sections of the book expanded upon, because then I can speak to you directly rather than make a generic video about what I feel is important. So any questions are welcome, but it seems like the chat's very quiet, but it's lovely to see you all. Thanks for coming. And Sunday we will begin our book. And just for you guys here, if any of you are clubbers, I'll just share what's going on in the poll, because it's very close, the poll. And oh no, we don't want to do that. That'll mess up the stream if I open it on my phone. The poll is currently, it looks like we'll be reading Jane Austen's Emma. So if you're interested in that, we're doing that on Sunday. And Zanyar has put a comment in. He said, hello there, David Weber. You're very welcome, my friend. Nice to see you, and I hope you found some value in that reading. But Zanyar says, I think the sense of being offended and a feeling of victimization is something the modern man-machine finds himself in quite a lot. Yes, I agree with you there, Zanyar, because that's the natural state of things, isn't it? We identify. I would say that that's identification and also internal considering. So those two things, if you look up in the index of the book or do the search on a PDF, that's why, because we feel that the world should be giving us more. We're victims and it's our suffering. I don't know when chapter 14 will be. Maybe not next week, but the week after, we'll say. Zanya, I won't give you any direct date, but chapter 14 will be very interesting, because we'll learn about the Enneagram, a fascinating symbol. And so let's say next week, so 2 weeks today, which will be, I should be able to do the maths, the 20th, Thursday the 20th, Zanyar, we will read chapter 14, and I welcome your enthusiasm and wanting to know when, because it keeps me honest. So thank you all for coming. Again, questions, comments, expansions are welcome, and I hope that some of you will be interested in Jane Austen's Emma, where we can learn about psychology and human nature in a very different form, but I'm excited about it nonetheless. But have a great weekend, look after yourselves, stay awake, as Russell Brand would say. I think that's his phrase. I mustn't steal it, but I'm going to say it now. His is stay free. So I'm going to modify it. Stay awake or wake up. Set those alarm clocks. Do those exercises. But most importantly, look after yourselves. Take care. And I hope you can make Sunday evening. Bye, guys. See you.